Hi, Julie here from Copy What I Use for Teenage Anxiety, and today's video is going to be focusing on the trigger, because with any child anxiety or child OCD there will always be a trigger that actually caused the anxiety to begin with. Now, whilst most teenagers at some point will suffer anxiety because it's normal and it's a normal part of functioning every day, it's when the anxiety becomes out of control, and in this instance of OCD, it's when it actually gets a child to have to carry out a series of rituals and often recruit other people to carry out those rituals as well, and whereby they won't even function or leave the house unless those rituals are carried out. That's when you know it's more than child anxiety and that it is something more to be concerned about, i.e. mental illness, which is clinical OCD. Okay, so what actually pulls the trigger? I mean, whilst I have to say that it's worth remembering that OCD is always triggered by anxiety, something will have happened at some point to make that child anxious, and what a child who goes on to develop teenage OCD suffers from then is the need to actually protect themselves from ever feeling that anxiety or fear again, and they will carry out all sorts of bizarre rituals in order to try and keep themselves protected, not for that to happen again. So what are the teenage triggers that can often lead then to more serious mental health issues like child OCD? There's bullying, and sadly that was the case for our eldest daughter. It started as mean behaviour that then became bullying towards her, and her way of protecting herself and stopping herself actually being a target for this bully was to keep herself as pure and as clean as she could, in order not to become, as she would refer to, as contaminated, so that she could never or ever be singled out for being different. It can also be as a result of bereavement. Now again, coincidentally, around the time she became seriously ill, she lost her granddad, who she was very close to. So we now think that also could have made the situation worse and made her more anxious, which led to worse OCD. It can be peer pressure, it can be just trying to be like others, because as confident as she seems on the outside, it's very important to her to have her friend circles around her and to keep herself looking as perfect as she can. That often results in putting fake tan on, fake eyelashes, you name it. She does it just to be as she sees fitting in, which is a sad thing about it, she fits in anyway, and everybody loves her for who she is. But sadly, once something goes in the mind, particularly teenage OCD, it's very, very hard to talk up to and to change those sort of rituals that she feels obliged to do. And like I said, it does actually recruit others as well, and we all ended up going down the same path. And it can cause many an argument. I mean, we've had another argument here this morning where even a simple thing like Christmas becomes, if you think it's difficult with families normally around Christmas, try having a child with OCD and restrictions that restricts the rest of the family as to where you can go and what you can do. And that's a whole new ball game. So anyway, an interesting one that I found that finding the trigger bit difficult, I've got to be honest, and it's something that can take a lot of therapy until you get to the bottom of it. And often there can be a few triggers that have caused it. For example, in our daughter's instance, it was one particular trigger that caused it to get worse, but they could even find triggers as far back as nursery, just a simple incident where the nursery teacher was making them wash their hands, and she'd actually smell their hands to make sure that they'd washed it with soap. And they said even that will have actually stuck in her mind at that time, i.e. an association with sort of a negative result if she didn't wash her hands. Again, that teacher, was she right or wrong? It's difficult to say, because my other daughter had exactly the same teacher, but it didn't have the same effect on her. But sadly, if you are one of those children that will be affected by child OCD, then unfortunately that can stay in the memory and have some harm later on. So it's a case of balancing, I guess. But the one thing that helped me to understand the trigger was when I just by chance came across an article with the therapist on the ITVs this morning. I don't know if you've ever come across them. They're called the Speakmans. They're absolutely brilliant and they're fascinating to watch. Anyway, they explained the situation as this: nobody, child or otherwise, is born with anxiety or fear. It's a learned behaviour. It's something that comes from an experience. For example, the one that I stumbled across was an incident where the girl was terrified of frogs. She wouldn't go anywhere near a frog. The reason was that she had kissed a frog, like in the fairy tales. I mean, it may sound funny, but obviously it wasn't funny to her. And she just by chance went in to see her mum, who was sat in a bedroom. Her mum looked up at her in aghast And of course the girl then, growing into a woman, had actually associated that as being because she had kissed a frog, and had then had a crippling fear of frogs. However, after therapy with the Speakmans, what it was actually the reaction and the fear and the look of fear on her mum's face that had actually put an associated fear with her with frogs. But actually what the mum was actually shocked by was her yellow face, and she'd actually contracted hepatitis, whereas she had actually associated it to being a negative thing concerned to kissing the frog. I've actually written a blog on this, and I've actually inserted a clip of the Speakmans. If you want to look at it, I'll put a link to the blog at the bottom of my YouTube video. But basically it's really, really important to find out what causes the initial trigger, because obviously therapy can then focus heavily on that area. I've got to say, man, it can still be a very slow process even once you find the trigger, but it does make the process somewhat easier. And then you'll have other triggers then. You'll have a different trigger, i.e. triggers that will in current day cause these situations. If anything, with the associated fear causes them to have anxiety, it's very important to act very quickly to calm that fear down, because otherwise the whole house becomes like a war zone very quickly. Again, I've written another blog on that, which is 3 calm and distraction techniques you may not have tried yet. Again, I'll put a link to that on the bottom of my YouTube if you want to check out that blog. I've also done a video on it as well. Okay, so that's today's video. It's mainly showing that whilst it's normal for most teenagers at some point to have anxiety, it's a very natural process. It's when it becomes out of control and that child can't function and actually won't let others function unless they've carried out a series of rituals. That's when it then is more of a clinical OCD that needs medical treatment and medical help with. But once you find the trigger, and it will be there, it's just a lot of probing. Some people try it through CBT. There's lots of different therapy you can try, but it is important to find out what that initial trigger is, so then you can then get medical help and support to know how to actually alleviate the figure associated with that trigger. And it's also important to know how to deal with anxiety then as it presents itself in current day situations, so that it doesn't have an impact on all of the family as a whole, as well as just the person suffering from it. Okay, so that's today's YouTube video on how to find the trigger for teenage OCD. If you found it helpful, please pop a like on the bottom or pop a little comment so that I know that what I'm sharing is useful. Again, I'll put the links to those other blogs at the bottom. And I'll also put a link to my Facebook group called The Greedy Monster. It's a new group I've started in the hope that lots of us parents can get together and share tips and advice and support one another with similar sort of instances. Okay, so that's it for today's video. Speak to you soon. Bye for now.